This is the laboratory interpretation guide for the Destiny Well Ultra Profile. The Destiny Well Ultra Profile is designed to give you a pattern overview of many different aspects of your health and how they fit together. It checks things like vitamin D levels, your sugar metabolism through a glycohemoglobin long-term sugar control test, cholesterol values including the good, the bad cholesterol, and triglycerides. It also checks your liver and kidney function, inflammatory markers like hsCRP, and your thyroid function. Altogether, these give a good picture of how your health is doing. We created this profile to provide a balanced clinical value with cost effectiveness and bring you what represents a snapshot of your overall health. If there are areas of special concern, then we have different panels to dig deeper into each area. But if you just want to glance and see how everything is doing together, this profile is for you. Insulin resistance is a key root cause risk factor. Now we know that insulin resistance increases cardiovascular disease risk, increases risk of things like Alzheimer's disease, and also for small blood vessel problems that cause things like erectile dysfunction, not to mention diabetes and prediabetes, and it's also associated with hypertension, all silent and visible killers. But did you know that it also affects your hormone metabolism? When you're resistant to insulin in men, you have a tendency to build up VAT, or visceral adipose tissue, that fat around the middle that causes changes in metabolism. It changes your hormone metabolism by activating an enzyme called aromatase that turns testosterone into estrogen. That changes your emotions and also builds up things like breast tissue in men. In women, insulin resistance activates the lyase pathways and leads to more production of androgen or testosterone type hormones, increasing acne, increasing body hair, changing voice, and other undesirable effects. With the evolving knowledge of lipids, it's important to know things like particle sizes. And so we think that we have a test that shows these in our advanced cardiovascular profile by measuring them directly, but we also check these indirectly by measuring things like the HDL to triglyceride ratio that gives us an indicator of what your particle sizes will likely be. Another great thing about the cardiovascular and blood sugar profile from Destiny Well is it puts you back in charge. Your insurance company might say if your cholesterol is normal, you only need to check it every 5 years. But if you've made a lot of progress, you've been dieting, you've lost weight, you've started a new exercise regimen, or you've fallen off the wagon and you want to know where you are, this puts the power back with you. You can check it as often as you like. When people develop insulin resistance, that often leads to metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome is a condition that's said to be present when you have 3 of these 5 things present. You have elevated triglycerides, you have elevated blood pressure, you have increased fat around the middle, which shows up with increased waist circumference, also called increased visceral adipose tissue, because it not only shows up in the belly on the outside, but it's in the inside of the abdomen and also around the heart. Elevated blood sugar is another factor, and then decreased HDL good cholesterol, values less than 40 in men and less than 50 in women. Any 3 or more of those give you a situation where you have metabolic syndrome. At Destiny Well, we define laboratory ranges in a sophisticated way. We use the standard ranges, represented by the blue bar here, from each reference lab that does a particular test to define the lab high and the lab low. If you have thyroid test results that are too low based on the lab's formal norm, then you have a diagnosis of lab low thyroid function or hypothyroidism. Similarly, for glucose, if you have a lab high blood sugar of over 126 on 2 occasions, then you meet the formal diagnosis criteria for diabetes. That's needed to make a medical diagnosis. But at Destiny Well, we think that there can be a lot more nuance. We believe that there's often an optimal range based on what we have found going forward helps people to live the healthiest lives, to be the healthiest, and to avoid disease. We triangulate this with the medical literature, with other people's standards, with our clinical practice experience, and all the different data points we can get, so we can come up with what we believe is optimal for a particular test result. Destiny Well also, in the red bars here, will define a Destiny Well high and a Destiny Well low. These may or may not line up exactly with a laboratory high or low, because sometimes we think that the range can be higher or lower, or that it needs to be different. And in between the optimal and the green bar, and the low and the high in the red bars, we have orange zones for moderately high and moderately low. They're not quite optimal, but they're not in the high or low zone. Hemoglobin A1C, or glycohemoglobin, is a critical blood sugar test. It was invented a number of years ago, and since then, diabetes care has been revolutionized. It measures how many sugar molecules are stuck onto the hemoglobin in red blood cells. And sugar molecules get stuck onto all sorts of proteins and cause glycation or damage to those molecules. So we can measure and get an average of what's going on with the blood sugar for about 3 months. Because typically red blood cells live for about 3 months and then they're recycled for parts. So if you measure how much sugar is stuck onto the hemoglobin molecules, it gives you this 3-month average. Now, if you're in a highly stressful situation, or you have abnormal red blood cells, or you have a lot of oxidation in your blood, then red cells don't live as long, and so you're getting maybe a 2-month average of that. But overall, we say this is a 3-month blood sugar test, and there are different ranges. So lab normal for us is 4 to 6% from the reference laboratory we're using. And we think that an optimal value is somewhere in the range of 4.6 to 4.9. As you get down to 4.2 to 4.5, you may be running your sugar a little bit low. Now that decreases cardiovascular risk, but when you have a sugar in that low range, you may be using more cortisol all the time to keep it there. And sustained high levels of cortisol in the 4.2 to 4.5, or even in the lower range of 4 to 4.2, high levels of cortisol can disrupt your normal bowel flora. They can shrink key areas in the brain like the hippocampus and lead to adrenal exhaustion and dysfunction of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the thing that regulates your cortisol and a number of your other hormones, as well as your day-night cycles. Now, elevated glycohemoglobin, 5 to 5.6, is considered abnormal, and over 5.7 is destiny well high. Now getting up above 6 is definitely in the lab high range. It's important to know that our ranges for both glycohemoglobin and fasting blood sugar are for non-diabetics. People with diabetes, especially those who take insulin or other medicines that significantly lower their blood sugar, are at increased risk of hypoglycemia when they have things that drive their sugar down. So if they run their glycohemoglobin or their fasting sugar in very low ranges, then they're at risk for hypoglycemia, which can lead to coma and death. And so often we build in a bit of margin of safety and try not to run the glycohemoglobin and the sugar as low with people who actually have diabetes. So if you don't have diabetes, or you have pre-diabetes and you're using diet and exercise and lifestyle modifications, then the targets we list are for you. If you do have diabetes, then you need to work even more closely with your personal physician or medical providers to get those levels in a range that is optimal for you as defined by your care team. When you hear people talking about vitamin D, they're usually talking about 25-hydroxyvitamin D. This includes vitamin D2 and vitamin D3. The Destiny Well test measures both of these together for a total 25-hydroxyvitamin D. It's also called 25-OH vitamin D. D3 may also be synthesized as well as being extracted from animal products. It may be somewhat more active than vitamin D2 that comes from plants. Occasionally, when you read about or research vitamin D, you'll come across references to 125-hydroxy or 125-OH vitamin D. This is the activated form of vitamin D. The body adds an extra hydroxyl group to activate the vitamin D, and that's the type that's most active in the body. This factor can go up in disorders like tuberculosis or certain fungal infections, and it can be deficient and need to be replaced specifically in renal failure in conditions where the body can't make this conversion. But most of the time when you hear about 25-hydroxyvitamin D, or you just hear about people talking about vitamin D in general, they're talking about D2 and D3, which is the 25-hydroxy form. Vitamin D is of key import to many tissues in the body. It's critical for the regulation of the immune system, but almost every tissue has vitamin D receptors and needs it for adequate function. Bone is a great example of this. New bone is laid down with the help of vitamin D. It's also important to have other minerals like magnesium and zinc. But vitamin K2 is also a super important factor to be given with vitamin D. It ensures that the body uses the vitamin D and the calcium in appropriate ways and that the calcium doesn't get laid down in places like the coronary arteries or other tissues that don't need it. Sunshine or not, people can be deficient in vitamin D. Even if you live in a sunny area, often people wear sunscreens, they aren't out during much of the day, they live in the basement, and their diet is low in vitamin D. So it's important to keep track of your vitamin D and to measure the level to know where you really are. Vitamin D is made from cholesterol in the body with exposure to sunlight. It can also be made with exposure to specific lamps or other types of sun lamps. Fish like salmon and tuna have vitamin D. Many cereals and other products are fortified with vitamin D, and it's very frequently added to milk and to some type of orange and other juices. Egg yolks, liver, and cod liver oil are also all good sources of vitamin D. Vitamin D ranges are a bit tricky. Vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin, and at extremely high levels, it does have toxicity. The normal lab range from our laboratory partner is greater than 25 nanograms per deciliter. At Destiny Well, we think the optimal vitamin D level is usually somewhere between 35 and 80. 35 is adequate for most functions in the body, and a value of around 70 to 80 is often helpful if you have immune deficiencies or if you have autoimmune diseases or other concerns like that. Values less than 25 are too low, 25 to 34 are mildly low, 81 to 100 are mildly high, but toxicity generally doesn't occur there, and over 100 is where we would draw the cutoff because we don't see much benefit, and at levels significantly higher than that, toxicity occurs. So don't get over 100 if you can help it, and try to be between 35 and 80. Ferritin is generally the best marker of iron status for most people. It is, however, also an inflammatory marker, so if you have acute or serious ongoing inflammation, sometimes it will be elevated or up in the normal range when it shouldn't be, just because it's a protein that goes up with inflammation. The laboratory reference range for ferritin is 20 nanograms per milliliter to 400 nanograms per milliliter. At Destiny Well, we think the range of 50 to 200 is optimal. Often neurologic problems and athletic performance improve when you get up over 50 to 75. Ferritin over 400 is definitely too high, and people with liver disease or iron storage problems like hemochromatosis, a genetic condition where too much iron is saved by the body and it causes toxicity in the liver and heart and other things, those people or people with serious liver disease will often have ferritin up in the range of 800 or 1,000 or more. The 200 to 400 range is moderately high, 20 to 49 is moderately low, and less than 20 is definitely low and usually indicates iron deficiency. Some of the main sources of iron deficiency, as manifested by low ferritin, are being a vegetarian and not taking any iron in your diet, being a junketarian, even if you do eat some meat, if you mostly eat junk food like French fries and potato chips and white bread, you're not going to get enough iron. And GI blood loss. You can lose blood from the stomach or the colon or any place in between, a drop at a time, and then you won't necessarily see it, but you can get to be anemic from that. When you have insufficient iron, resulting in iron deficiency, you can have a number of symptoms. One of the most common is fatigue and decreased exercise tolerance. People are lethargic. They also have immune system dysfunction and get more frequent infections. The nervous system gets more twitchy, and they feel cold more often. They have less resistance to being cold. They have impaired learning and brain function. All of these things can happen together or just a single one. Most thyroid hormone released from the thyroid gland is the T4. Some of that gets bound to protein, and then some of it is free circulating around in the system. In the cells, especially the liver, the majority of T4 is converted into T3. If the gut microbiome, the bacteria in the gut, are healthy, about 20% of the thyroid hormone is converted from the T4 to the active T3 there. Then it's reabsorbed back into the circulation and goes to the cells. We also mentioned that adrenal function is critical. The thyroid needs normal adrenal function, normal cortisol levels in order to produce adequate thyroid hormone and for it to work at the cellular level. This is one of my favorite diagrams. It shows the feedback loop and how the brain and the thyroid work together and how they talk to each other. A brain area called the hypothalamus puts out a hormone called TRH, or thyrotropin releasing hormone. That goes down to the anterior pituitary, which is also in the brain. The pituitary gland is where the TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, is made. Thyroid stimulating hormone does exactly what it says. It stimulates the thyroid to make thyroid hormone. Most of what it puts out is T4, but about 7% of its output is active T3 hormone. Then, when the T3, T4 hormone increases, it gets into balance, and things like low body temperature go back up to normal, heart rate, blood pressure, bowel function, many things that were out of balance normalize when the T3 and the T4 concentrations are normal. When the brain sees adequate or increased amounts of T3 and T4, then it stops sending out extra signal of TSH, and the TSH level goes down. So when everything is working normally, that's how the thyroid and the brain talk to each other and how they regulate each other. This is where it gets tricky. Most doctors and most patients assume that all thyroid problems happen at the level of the thyroid gland. When a thyroid problem, either too high or too low, either hyper or hypothyroidism, happens in the level of the thyroid gland, it's called primary hyperthyroidism for too high and primary hypothyroidism for too low. That's the way most doctors look at thyroid tests and interpret them. What that fails to recognize is that sometimes the problem is in the brain, and that's called secondary or tertiary. If it's at the level of the pituitary in the brain, it's secondary, and if it's at the level of the hypothalamus or higher, it's called tertiary. The reason that's important is that they have somewhat opposite and differing effects on what the tests look like, and they may look like hyperthyroidism when it's actually hypo, or hypo when it's actually hyper, if you're just looking at the TSH and you don't check the other hormones. Primary thyroid problems happen at the level of the thyroid gland itself. Primary hypothyroidism is one of the most common conditions we encounter in medical practice. Hypothyroidism usually comes from something called Hashimoto's thyroiditis, after the doctor who discovered that antibodies were attacking the thyroid in an autoimmune fashion and destroying its ability to secrete thyroid hormone. This is the main kind of primary hypothyroidism we see, but nutritional deficiencies and other problems can also cause this. Hyperthyroidism can also be autoimmune, that's called Graves' disease, or you can have a thyroid nodule that doesn't respond to the feedback loops and just keeps putting out more and more thyroid hormone on its own and doesn't recognize or respond to the signals from the pituitary and the hypothalamus. Both of those conditions, primary hyper and primary hypothyroidism, are in the expected direction that we see for thyroid tests because what we're looking for most of the time is we're looking for the responses we would see as if the condition were primary. But in the back of our mind, we always have to keep in mind that it could be secondary or tertiary. If the problem is in the brain, then the problem is whether the pituitary and the hypothalamus signaling the pituitary send the right signal. If it's secondary, that's a pituitary problem, and if it's tertiary, it's the hypothalamus that sends the signals to the pituitary. So for instance, if the brain just puts out too much TSH, say you have an adenoma or a benign tumor of the brain, and it sends out too much TSH signal, it just keeps sending that signal because the tumor is secreting that, then the thyroid will respond and produce more thyroid hormone. The same thing is true if there's damage to the pituitary. Sometimes after childbirth, people get a condition where they have a hemorrhage into that area or they have bleeding into the brain that destroys that, or people who've had brain tumors or radiation or damage to the brain, they may lose the ability to secrete TSH. Then they have a secondary tertiary problem in terms of not producing the TSH, and if the signal is not sent to the thyroid, then the thyroid doesn't know to make thyroid hormone. TSH is the most commonly measured thyroid hormone. As we discussed, many doctors don't measure anything other than TSH. But for me, that's like looking at a jigsaw puzzle with only one piece. If the puzzle has 5 or 6 or 7 pieces, you get a lot more complete picture of what's actually going on if you put them all together than if you just look at a single piece. TSH has a reference lab range of 0.4 on the low and 4.0 on the high. At Destiny Well, we think the optimal level of TSH is 1.8 to 3.0, with values over 3 representing thyroid function in primary hypothyroidism that is too low. 90 to 95% of the population have a TSH under 3, and so we think it makes sense to be in the range below that. We think a value of under 0.4 is too low, and between 0.5 and 1.7 may also be on the low side. So here's why thyroid functions are so tricky for most people. It's not intuitive, but it is true that an elevated TSH means low thyroid function in primary hypothyroidism at the level of the thyroid gland. TSH is the signal from the brain to the thyroid gland to make more thyroid hormones. In the most common condition, the primary hypothyroidism that occurs from Hashimoto's thyroiditis, where the gland is attacked by autoimmune disease, or other conditions at the level of the thyroid gland, where the thyroid is not making adequate hormone, then the brain says, I'm not receiving enough thyroid hormone, I should put out the stimulating hormone, the TSH, to tell the thyroid gland to make more. So while intuitively we think, oh, TSH is the main thyroid test, if it's high, that must mean my thyroid function's high. The opposite is true. It means the signal to make more thyroid hormone is high, and that happens in the setting of hypothyroidism or low thyroid function. So just remember, high TSH means low thyroid function, means hypothyroidism most of the time, because most thyroid problems happen at the level of the thyroid gland, and that's the way the brain responds, and we're measuring the brain response with a TSH. The brain is mostly responsive to free T4, which is somewhat surprising since free T3 is the active hormone throughout the rest of the body. And it's an area that can get us into trouble some because we think, oh, we have an adequate T4, everything else must be good. But that's not necessarily true because there are a number of factors, both nutritional and stress and other hormones that have to be in balance for adequate conversion of T4 into T3 and also to keep T4 from being converted into RT3, the blocking hormone. So normally, when the T4 goes up, the TSH goes down, and when the T4 goes down, that's the main hormone put out by the thyroid gland, the brain senses there's not enough T4, puts out TSH to stimulate the thyroid gland to produce more hormones. So the pattern we see in primary hypothyroidism is TSH elevated, free T4 decreased, and free T3 is also decreased. C-reactive protein is a protein that goes up when there's inflammation in the blood. Not only is it a marker of inflammation, but the CRP itself is actually a damaging factor. When we look for low levels of chronic inflammation rather than high levels of inflammation, we look at a test called high-sensitivity C-reactive protein that brings out the details of what happens with low-grade inflammation. Regular C-reactive protein will go way up with diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and chronic infections. But high sensitivity C-reactive protein has a lower set value, and those ranges are more looking for chronic low-grade inflammation that's associated with everything from increased cancer risk to increased risk of Alzheimer's to more migraines to more depression, and it's especially useful in evaluating for cardiovascular disease. The reference range from our laboratory partner is 0 to 4, with values over 4 being abnormal. We find at Destiny Well the optimal range is less than 1, and many cardiovascular protocols use this cutoff as well. Values of 1.1 to 3.0 are mildly elevated, and values of over 3 are definitely associated with increased cardiovascular and other risk. Total cholesterol is the sum of all the different types of cholesterol, the LDL, bad cholesterol, the HDL, good cholesterol, and other fractions like IDL and VLDL cholesterol. These together comprise total cholesterol. Cholesterol serves a number of functions in the body. When it goes up, it sometimes is an inflammatory reaction, and the cholesterol is buffering and protecting the body from oxidative damage. Cholesterol is also important for the synthesis of hormones. It's the precursor for them, and also for things like vitamin D, which are steroid-related molecules that the body can synthesize in the presence of sunlight. We set our cholesterol norms a little higher than some people. We think that our laboratory partners range of 0 to 200 is fine, but our optimal range we believe is in the 150 to 200 area. This gives you enough cholesterol for your membranes to function, enough to use as hormone precursors and to make vitamin D, but not too much. We think that 201 to 239 is mildly elevated, and values over 240 are generally elevated to the problem range. Similarly, 111 to 149 is in the mildly low range, and we call cholesterol less than 110 too low, because you're probably in a range where you're not making enough steroid hormones, your membranes may not be as healthy, and you can get into other problems. Triglycerides are another fat in the blood. They're closely tied to your sugar metabolism. The normal for our laboratory partners reference range is 0 to 200. At Destiny Well, we like an optimal range of 60 to 100. Triglycerides are important for your fat metabolism. Values over 100 are associated with increased problems, and your HDL good cholesterol is often going down when that happens, and we call greater than 150 abnormal, as do some of the other major medical societies and groups. Values of 36 to 59 are mildly low, and when your triglycerides get less than 35, then they think they're too low, maybe representing some problems with your metabolism. So carbohydrates and alcohol raise triglycerides substantially. Sometimes the high triglycerides run in families. And then if your thyroid function is out of balance, if your thyroid is too low, your triglycerides will often go up significantly. And if your thyroid function is too high, if you have hyperthyroidism, then your triglycerides may actually go down lower than you want them. LDL cholesterol is called bad cholesterol. LDL has been associated with a lot of cardiovascular risk, and many times LDL is what's targeted for therapy with drugs like statins or from diet and other programs. Our laboratory reference range is from 0 to 160, and at Destiny Well, we think somewhere in the 70 to 120 range is optimal. On the lower side of that, if you have many risk factors or you've had previous cardiovascular problems, and on the higher side of that, if you're not having problems. We think less than 40 is too low, where you may not actually have enough cholesterol to synthesize things like vitamin D and to keep your membranes healthy. And then over 160 is definitely too high. We call 121 to 160 moderately high and 40 to 69 moderately low. Now, how your LDL relates to your overall health not only has to do with LDL itself, but it has to do with the condition of LDL, whether the molecules are oxidized and more damaging, or whether the LDL particles are big or small. And some of our other calculations and our other profiles will get into that. But these are the ranges that we set. You should know that if you have advanced cardiovascular disease, if you've had a heart attack, if you have multi-vessel disease in your heart, then your cardiologist or we might say that even lower ranges are appropriate to get down under 70 or down under 60. So those are considerations sometimes managed by specialty physicians, and they're outside the realm of what we generally talk about here at Destiny Well. But you may see other people recommending this for good reason, and that would be something to work with an individual physician on to find out what's best for you. HDL cholesterol is also called good cholesterol. The values of HDL are different in men and women, and in men, the normal laboratory reference range is anything above 40. They don't really define a too high range. At Destiny Well, we think values around 60 to 90 are probably optimal, and 41 to 59 are only moderately low, and many people are okay in this range. When you get below 40, you definitely have increased risk. HDL molecule takes cholesterol back from the blood vessels in the body to the liver for reprocessing. So it's a way to keep cholesterol from building up. Values over 90 sometimes could potentially be a problem, because we're finding out that sometimes people don't clear HDL from their system. So once it's filled up with types of cholesterol that are supposed to go back to the liver and get reprocessed, instead of actually having receptors and going into the liver, it's circulating around and around. So values over 90 look like they may be associated with dysfunctional or not fully functioning HDL in some people. So we think that up to 90 is probably good for most people. Over 90 raises that question about whether the HDL is functioning normally. But values under 40 are definitely a significant problem. In women, HDL performs that same function of taking cholesterol back from the body and the blood vessels to the liver for reprocessing, but the values are slightly different. In women, the HDL should be over 50. We still believe the 60 to 90 is the optimal target, and 50 to 59 is in the mildly low range, with values over 90 possibly indicating dysfunctional or not fully functioning HDL, where it's high in the bloodstream, but that's because it's not being cleared and doing its job of taking cholesterol back from the body to the liver for processing. HDL cholesterol is also called good cholesterol. The values of HDL are different in men and women, and in men, the normal laboratory reference range is anything above 40. They don't really define a too high range. At Destiny Well, we think values around 60 to 90 are probably optimal, and 41 to 59 are only moderately low, and many people are okay in this range. When you get below 40, you definitely have increased risk. HDL molecule takes cholesterol back from the blood vessels in the body to the liver for reprocessing. So it's a way to keep cholesterol from building up. Values over 90 sometimes could potentially be a problem because we're finding out that sometimes people don't clear HDL from their system. So once it's filled up with types of cholesterol that are supposed to go back to the liver and get reprocessed, instead of actually having receptors and going into the liver, it's circulating around and around. So values over 90 look like they may be associated with dysfunctional or not fully functioning HDL in some people. So we think that up to 90 is probably good for most people. Over 90 raises that question about whether the HDL is functioning normally. But values under 40 are definitely a significant problem. Non-HDL cholesterol is a calculated value. It's a simple equation subtracting the HDL good cholesterol from the total cholesterol. It also, in addition to the LDL bad cholesterol, includes fractions such as IDL and VLDL, intermediate density lipoprotein and very low density lipoprotein. Both of these are very high risk for cardiovascular risk and are damaging to the heart and blood vessels. The calculated normal for this is between 0 and 190 for a non-HDL, but optimal at Destiny Well is in the 100 to 130 range. Values of less than 100 may indicate that you don't have enough total cholesterol to help your membranes and your hormone synthesis. 131 to 160 is mildly elevated, and values over 160 probably are higher risk, and so Destiny Well has set their too high range at anything over 160. The triglyceride to HDL ratio is another calculated ratio that we find to be very valuable. Values over 4 are considered to be laboratory high. But we've also found that setting the values lower is helpful. Our optimal zone is 2 or under, mildly elevated 2 to 3, and elevated greater than 3. If your number is greater than 1.5, it predicts that your LDL particle size is going to start to go down. Smaller LDL particles infiltrate the blood vessels and cause disease more readily than larger LDL particles. So this is a way to get a glimpse at your LDL particle number in addition to ways that would measure it directly in more advanced profiles. We really want this ratio down around 2 or less, and over 3 is clearly associated with increased risk of heart and blood vessel disease. The most common way to measure kidney function is by testing a substance called creatinine in the blood. Men and women have different norms for creatinine because it's based on muscle mass. Creatinine is a byproduct of muscle metabolism that's excreted in a fairly consistent way. If we measure how much the kidneys are able to get rid of and how much is left in the blood, that's a reflection of how well the kidneys are working. There's a caveat that sometimes a person's creatinine will look normal if their muscle mass is low, and that's one of the reasons that women have lower creatinine than men. Our laboratory reference range for creatinine in men is 0 to 1.4 milligrams per deciliter. Destiny Well feels that the optimal creatinine is between 0.6 and 1.2 for a man, that between 0.4 and 0.5 is mildly low, and less than 0.4 is low. On the other side of the graph, Mildly high is 1.2 to 1.3, and high is greater than 1.4. Now, creatinine is not just linear. So if you have a creatinine of 1.8 or 2.0, you think, well, maybe that's just a little bit up. But actually, that represents significant kidney dysfunction. Around 4 is very severe kidney dysfunction, and when you get to the area of around 10, you're likely to need dialysis. Now, creatinine is tricky to interpret. It goes up with age if kidney function declines, but it also goes down with age as muscle function and muscle mass decreases. So it's possible that a very big man with a large frame and a lot of muscle could have perfectly normal kidney function at 1.4 for his creatinine. But if that person was very thin, has small frame, and didn't have much muscle, a creatinine of 1.4 might reflect kidney dysfunction. In women, a gender-neutral lab range goes up to 1.4 for creatinine, but we feel, based on laboratory ranges around the country, that a 1.2 upper limit is appropriate for most women. If a woman was very muscular or large-framed, she might have a creatinine of 1.4 and be okay, but typically 1.2 is a better upper limit. We feel the optimal creatinine for a woman is between 0.5 and 1.1. Mildly decreased is in the 0.4 range, and too low is less than 0.3. 1.01 to 1.2 is mildly high, and greater than 1.2 is too high. When someone's creatinine is too low, does that mean their kidney function is too good? No, most likely it would mean that they don't have enough muscle mass, and low muscle mass is a risk for a number of problems. It's associated with decline in cognitive function, but it's also very closely associated with metabolism of glucose. Muscle is king in the metabolism of glucose, and if you lose muscle mass, then your glucose metabolism becomes challenged and often unhealthy. BUN, or blood urea nitrogen, is another waste product of metabolism. It's a waste product of nitrogen protein metabolism, and the body is always trying to get rid of it. Like creatinine, we can measure the amount in the blood to see how well the kidneys are doing their job of getting rid of it. A special situation is when you have bleeding into the GI tract. So if you have a bleeding stomach ulcer or bleeding into your colon, you will reabsorb a lot of nitrogen and falsely elevate your BUN. But most of the time, it tracks kidney function very well, and it's more sensitive to the effects of hydration. The BUN to creatinine ratio is something that we found exceptionally helpful. A BUN to creatinine ratio of 10 to 16 is the DestinyWell optimal zone. Less than 10 is too low. 17 to 20 is mildly high for DestinyWell, and greater than 20 is too high. Our reference lab range is between 0 and 20. The best thing about the BUN to creatinine ratio is that since BUN is more sensitive to hydration effects, you can tell if a person is dehydrated. A value of over 20 suggests dehydration, and a value of 30 is often seen when patients are on diuretics and are dehydrated inside their vascular volume. I've seen BUN to creatinine ratios well above 40, mostly in heart failure patients who were treated aggressively with diuretics to try to get the fluid out of their system. Sometimes these patients were okay, but we did know that they had intravascular volume depletion. That means the amount of blood and fluid inside their blood vessels was low, and that led to an elevated BUN to creatinine ratio. I always use this when I see patients in the emergency room trying to decide what their hydration status is. It's a quick way to tell if someone's running dehydration most of the time, or if they're doing a good job with their fluid intake and absorbing and using the fluids in their cells. Now we'll move on to liver function tests. Two of the most common tests are AST and ALT. These are enzymes that live inside liver cells, and most of the time, the majority of them stay in the liver cell. When liver cells are damaged or inflamed, they start to leak into the bloodstream. The reference lab range is between 0 and 50 milligrams per deciliter. At DestinyWell, we think a value of 10 to 30 is optimal, 5 to 10 is mildly low, and less than 5 is definitely low. 30 to 50 is mildly high, and greater than 50 is high. Now, most doctors just look at AST to try to determine if you have liver damage, if the cells are leaking AST enzyme into the bloodstream, and then they look for causes of liver inflammation, infection, damage, or toxicity. But we also know that low levels of AST are associated with low B vitamins, especially with vitamin B6 deficiency. So if you see a very low AST, That's something to think of and probably check for. ALT is another enzyme from within liver cells that leaks out when there's liver damage or inflammation. ALT is actually more specific to the liver because AST occurs in the liver, but there's also a good bit of it in muscle or in heart tissue and other areas. The reference laboratory range for ALT is between 0 and 60 milligrams per deciliter. At Destiny Well, we think a value of 10 to 30 is optimal, 5 to 10 is mildly low, and less than 5 is too low. On the other end of the spectrum, 31 to 60 is mildly elevated, and greater than 60 is too high. Most causes of liver cell injury are associated with a greater increase of ALT than AST, and when this is not the case, sometimes it gives us a clue as to what's going on. Many doctors look at ALT just for elevation. They don't think it can be too low, but actually, the data shows that low levels of ALT are associated with decreases in B vitamins, especially vitamin B6. So we think that ALT can be too low. We've set our optimal range at 10 to 30 because we believe that many people who have elevation in the 31 to 60 range are starting to get liver inflammation. They're getting insulin resistance, they may be getting some fat cells in the liver, and they're on their way to increased risk of fatty liver changes and problems. Sometimes it's of value to calculate the ratio of AST to ALT. With most liver injuries, ALT goes up more than AST. But if the AST to ALT ratio is greater than or equal to 2 to 1, that suggests that the problem might be from alcohol-related liver disease. That's especially true if the GGT, or gamma-glutamyl transferase, is also elevated. GGT goes up with a number of toxic exposures, including alcohol. Another thing to know about liver functions is they go up more and more with higher and higher levels of damage. But with chronic liver disease, when liver inflammation leads to fatty accumulation and eventually leads to cirrhosis, which is a replacement of the normal liver cells with scar tissue, then there's not as many healthy liver cells around to leak enzymes. And so actually, as you progress toward liver failure, you may actually have lower and lower liver function tests rather than higher and higher after a period of time. Let's talk about the magnitude of liver function test elevations when the liver cells are injured and what kinds of patterns we see with different diseases. With alcohol-related fatty liver disease, the AST can be up to 8 times the upper limit of normal and ALT perhaps 5 times the limit. In non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, that's the kind that comes from insulin resistance and visceral adipose, fat around the middle, AST and ALT usually don't go more than 4 times the upper limit of the lab range. Acute viral hepatitis and liver problems caused by toxic exposures often will have AST and ALT values greater than 25 times the upper limits of normal. Sometimes these conditions can even be life-threatening acutely. Chronic hepatitis C has a wide variability. Usually it's less than twice the upper limit of normal, and rarely it's as much as 10 times the upper limit of normal. Chronic hepatitis B infection has a situation where levels fluctuate. AST and ALT may be normal, though most patients have mild to moderate elevations, usually in the 1 to 2 times normal range. They go up even more when there's an exacerbation, when the disease flares up. Then levels can be 10 times or more the upper limits of normal. GGT, which is also sometimes called GGTP, is an enzyme that is found in the liver cells, but it's also found in the bile ducts that lead from the liver to the gallbladder down to the bowel. The normal reference lab range for GGT is 1 milligram per deciliter on the low end and 50 milligrams per deciliter on the high end. Destiny Well sets an optimal range of 10 to 30, mildly elevated 31 to 50, abnormal greater than 50, mildly low 5 to 19, and clinically low or concerningly low less than 5. GGT is very sensitive to toxins. Alcohol is one such toxin, and people who drink chronically to excess will often have elevated GGT levels. But functional medicine doctors also use GGT as an evidence of your toxic burden. How many toxic chemicals are you chronically exposed to, and how hard is your liver having to work to get rid of them? That's why we think the mildly elevated range of 31 to 50 is appropriate and raises an area of concern for us as to what your total toxic burden may be. Tests included in the Destiny Well Ultra profile include the glycohemoglobin A1C sugar test, vitamin D level, ferritin test of iron, HSCRP inflammation test, TSH thyroid test, a cholesterol profile that includes total cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, non-HDL cholesterol, triglycerides, and triglyceride to HDL ratio. It also includes creatinine and BUN kidney tests and the BUN to creatinine ratio, which is good to determine hydration status. AST, ALT, and GGT liver function tests round out the profile to give a very comprehensive overview of your health. The Destiny Well Ultra profile gives you a broad view of how different systems in your body are working, from your cardiovascular health and systemic inflammation markers to your thyroid and vitamin D status. We target key elements that you should look at on a regular basis to achieve optimal health. At Destiny Well, we've been extremely fortunate to find some amazingly good coaches, people with backgrounds of success in varied fields who bring all sorts of resources and talent and skill to help you. These folks have many years of clinical experience, and they know how to be of assistance at every step of the way, from motivation to connecting you with the right resources to finding things that you need to get you on your journey. To learn more, go to destinywell.com/coaching to meet our team and find out how they can be of service to you.